Okay, I think we'll begin now. This webinar is originating from the City of Vancouver, which is founded on the traditional and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. Speakers may also be presenting from other locations today. Hello, my name is Sophie King. I am the Manager of Professional Learning at PIBC, and I'm very happy to welcome you to our webinar on AI, where we hope to discuss some practical applications and begin a conversation on the legal, ethical, and equity issues associated with this ever-evolving technology. This webinar is being produced as part of the BC Land Summit, a multidisciplinary 3-day conference taking place in 2024 on May 8th, 9th, and 10th in Nanaimo, BC, beautiful Nanaimo, BC. This webinar is being recorded, and a link to both the recording and the slide presentation will be emailed to you shortly after the webinar. If you have any questions during any of the presentations, please type them in the chat window below. And if the speakers are not able to respond with a quick answer right away, your questions will be addressed during the Q&A portion of the program after all of the presenters are finished. Before I introduce our first speaker, I would like to welcome the PIBC President, Emily Adden, to present the President's Minute Update, a new feature going forward. Emily, please turn on your webcam and your mic. Hello.
Hello. Thanks, Sophie.
You're very welcome.
Great. And hello, everyone, this fine day, or at least it's fine in Vancouver. So the President's Minute was requested by fellow board members at a recent strategic planning retreat, and especially the students and the candidate member wanted to get the President out doing verbal updates at the webinars. But please let Sophie King know if this works for you. It's the grand experiment. So my update today is that the Planning Institute of BC chapter chairs recently, from all across BC and the Yukon, recently got together, and among other things, they discussed the peer learning network that PIBC is partnering with the province on. With that peer learning network, we'll be doing a kickoff online webinar exploring new legislation and the regulations when they come out in the new year. But the PIBC chapter chairs also requested this be followed up by a traveling roadshow, and I'll put that in quotation marks, that would go out in person across the province, perhaps with one provincial staff person, a registered professional planner with local government experience, and a legal expert. So if you're keen on this, please let us know, or speak to your local PIBC chapter. If you would prefer to see us zero in on specific aspects of the new regulations when the roadshow comes to town in your neighborhood. So that's my President's Minute. Back over to you, Sophie.
Great. Thank you, Emily. And now with that, we will begin our presentation. I would like to introduce our first speaker, Ryan Smith, Divisional Director, Planning and Development Services at the City of Kelowna. Ryan will be presenting on how the City of Kelowna is leading the way in terms of using AI to streamline public services, among other uses. And I see Ryan is online. Hello, Ryan.
Hi, Sophie. Thanks for having me.
You're very welcome. And I must mention that Ryan is in the middle of hosting a LGMA seminar, educational seminar today, and this is his lunch hour, and he's spending it with us. Thank you, Ryan.
Yeah, thanks again, Sophie. You'll pop up my presentation here. Perfect. I wanted to start by qualifying my expertise to do this. I'm not an IT guy, although I play one sometimes on social media. I am definitely qualified as a planner. This definitely falls into the opportunities part of the presentation. And so I've got about 20 minutes here, and I'll try and walk you through a little bit of Kelowna's journey as it comes to AI, our why, and then our what, and then maybe a little bit of where we're going if I have time. We realized quite a while ago in Kelowna that there's a lot of things that local governments do that make planning processes challenging. We also participated in the provincial government's DAPR review, and we're pleased to see some of our recommendations and suggestions make it the whole way through the process. What we heard repeatedly from all over the province and from many planners and from the provincial government staff was that, development processes are super confusing. There's way too many bylaws and processes that apply. They're hard to navigate. They're often contradictory. And there should be some way to improve tools at the front end of the development process that help staff navigate or help the public who are trying to apply for something navigate planning and development processes. So we kind of started that as our problem statement, but we'd already had this, the use of AI in the back of our minds. We'd been thinking for a long time about how do we turn our zoning bylaw into a searchable database? And is there any way that we can make that land-based so that it links into our Esri mapping system as well? The other why has kind of evolved over the last, I would say, 8 or 9 years as the housing crisis has become more and more serious across the province, the country, the continent. A little bit about the data, and this is just planning front counter inquiry data. This doesn't include our development services teams. The number of inquiries that we're seeing is increasing year over year. Our staff can't keep up to the number of inquiries. The inquiries that we're getting are often far more complex than they were in the past. We track the types of inquiries too. And so we know a little bit about what people are asking, what they're interested in, what's challenging for them. The other part of the why is Kelowna's housing needs. And we've had a vacancy rate of less than 3%, often less than 1% for many, many years. And when we get into the realm of housing, we start with our housing wheelhouse, and we did a recent housing needs assessment that examined all parts of the wheelhouse and found an existing deficit between 3,750 and 5,000 homes in the community of various types. So this means that we're nobody to move to our community next year. We still have that many people in the community who are living in like some type of modified or living arrangement that doesn't meet their needs today, or that may be homeless today. Another key finding was that we have a massive amount of homes needed to meet future demand over the next 10 years. 50% more than we expected when we updated our official community plan a couple of years ago. And what that looks like over the next probably 8 years now is between 18,000 and 26,000 housing units. And to break that down to like what we're going to have to do every year, we're going to need between 1,800 and 2,600 new homes built in our community every year. And that's a gross number across the spectrum. So we're looking at pulling all the levers we can to make that easier for people to permit housing and build housing in our community. And so the important part of this chart as well is if you look at the dotted line, that's building permits issued, and the solid line is occupancy permits issued. So we're issuing far more building permits than are getting occupancy permits. And the reason for that is mostly an economic one. People are getting building permits and deciding that they can't build because it's too expensive. They can't find trades. Maybe they're waiting for new regulations and they're letting permits lapse. But there's a whole bunch of reasons there. And our goal is to bring that number closer together year in and year out. I would also mention we kind of look at this as a bit of a housing funnel. So there's all sorts of things right now that are impacting the amount of housing that's getting built. So more housing needs to be going in the top of the funnel, oftentimes to get the same amount out of the bottom, just because of all the challenges that we list here. I'm just speeding through this a little bit because I want to make sure we get to the present part of the presentation that everybody wants to hear about, which is how we're using AI and what we're doing. So again, when we look at levers we're pulling levers that relate to approval certainty, pre-zoning, and this was in advance of any of the provincial announcements or legislative changes, process improvements, and rental incentives. And we see our AI chatbot as a process improvement, and it's a process improvement that sits in front of our development process. We got a grant from the UBCM through the DAPR grant process of $350,000 a couple of years ago to explore how we could use AI to improve the front end of our permitting system. So this is grant funded. Yeah. At that point, we had a relationship that we leveraged with Microsoft, and Microsoft funded the equivalent, so another $350,000. And then we used in-kind staff time as well, and a little bit of other budget. So,
Ryan, excuse me.
yes.
I just wanted to let you know that the chatbot function, as you probably noticed, is not showing up on the Adobe Connect. However,
Yep,
when we send the presentation out to everybody, they'll be able to see it.
Yeah, and I'm not gonna demo it today because for whatever reason, oftentimes it doesn't work or it's slow when we do it live.
Okay.
The city has a bunch of experience using digital assistants. We were developing digital or chatbots that are AI powered for facility bookings, airport wait times, winter maintenance. We have a predictive AI function that you can call into, and it's a voice chatbot that can give you the last time your street was plowed and the likelihood of it getting plowed again, or at what point in the next few days it will be plowed again, which is heavily used. So we launched a beta version of our development, our permitting chatbot on October the 3rd. And what we wanted to do, our vision was to again help people who aren't familiar with development and permitting processes to get into the process and guide them to a point where they could then apply for a permit. So we've built portion journeys through our chatbot. At the same time as we're building a new development application system behind the scenes and permitting system using CityWorks to build that behind the system. But the goal is eventually that you don't know whether you're in our city chatbot journey or whether you're into our CityWorks journey. It connects you right through. So if you have all the information you need to permit a swimming pool or a single family dwelling, it will walk you through that, help you submit your application, and then give you an application number and allow you to track your application that way. And what that looks like is in the bottom right-hand corner of the screen here. We have a need help. Click here and start chatting with us. Chat now. And there's various journeys here now that are coming online where we'll help you through that journey. And a good example is you could ask the chatbot could I do a daycare on my property? And the chatbot will ask you what the address of your property is. And then we'll say, yes, you can do it. It's a permitted use on your property. You can do it, but you need to provide 2 parking stalls and you need a business license. Do you want to go into a process to get a business license? And then it will take you through that process and guide you there. But again, trying to simplify the process and help people through it. So our virtual assistant's name is Kai, and that's short for Kelowna AI. Funny story. One of the members of our team saw emails floating around that said AI chatbot on them and thought we were talking about somebody named Al Chabot, and that it was like an applicant that people kept talking about. And so we wanted to name the chatbot Al Chabot for a little while, but we landed on Kai, which is a name that we're going to give to many of our virtual assistants at the City of Kelowna. So to give a housing example, you could right now log into the single family house chatbot, and it will guide you through the building permit process, what you would need to submit a building permit for a single family home or a carriage house. And again, it's the idea that we should be making housing easier to permit. And so it will help you with the following topics, and you can drill down into any of these, and it will ask you questions to put you through a pathway here. So I just have a 1 week of AI chatbot data. So when you get into the ethics and the use side of this, which is very important to us, being an early adopter, the public trust in what we're doing and the tracking of what we're doing and how we're improving it. Again, super important. So we're trying to figure out what's getting used, how it's getting used, what are the the most popular pieces, and other pieces of this that we don't need to work on anymore because nobody's using them. And so we're trying to track the data on it and come up with, focus our changes based on the most used pieces or where people are having the most problems using it. Part of this chatbot is also us letting the public know that that AI is responding when they're on the chatbot. So we do have qualifiers to advise people that AI is giving answers, and the AI is not going to the World Wide Web for answers. The AI is solely focused and looking at portions of our internal data set to give answers. So you're getting Kelowna only answers. So the what's next question. So we've been working on those journeys, and we're just related to building and permitting, and planning has been lagging behind a little bit, but for good reason. We knew that legislative changes were coming, and a piece of this that we just put on fast track was the infill housing piece. And so what we want to do is sort of meld the SSMU legislation with our chatbot journeys so that by the spring, you'll be able to log in and say, can I do a fourplex on my property? And the chatbot will say, what's your address? And then walk you through the process and your options for putting more units of infill housing on your property, and dive into what the costs of that might look like as well. And so we actually want to start adding more pieces into this as well that fall outside of the city. So again, where you see that, if I popped back to that graph of the gap between building permits applied for and occupancy permits, oftentimes it's things like financing. It's the money side of development that is causing hangups in the process or preventing people from proceeding. And so we're talking to a couple different financial institutions now about, lending is different for a single family house and a carriage house or a suite than it is for a fourplex, I understand. And so we are trying to make sure that we can bring those banks to the table so that they can connect people with lending options, so that they understand, if I want to build a fourplex with pre-approved designs, here's how I could finance it. And we're working with the Home Builders of Canada, Okanagan chapter, and just starting to talk to them about, well, what would a pro forma look like in a number of different situations? Can we connect people with approximate costs so they know that as well? So we're going to start to try and incorporate those into the chatbot process as well. So again, a few other things that are coming. We're working on the ability to have AI write portions of council reports and engineering memorandums. And so the engineering memorandums is in process right now, and it will help. It will dive into our data systems and figure out pipe sizes and road standards, and recommend, if they don't meet the standard that we specify in our current bylaws, what potential upgrades might need to come. Again, I think that's going to have to come with some significant beta testing to make sure we're not giving out incorrect information. And we've just had our AI learn the BC building code, plumbing code, and electrical code. And so we did that just as a sort of a side of desk project. And so the AI knows BC building code now and can answer questions about the BC building code. And so our plan checkers internally, we've turned this tool towards them and said, okay, rather than opening your BC building code, why don't you ask the AI chatbot questions about the building code? And so you don't need to open the book. You can go, you can just dive into that chatbot, and it'll be quicker and easier for you. And so we're again trying to connect them with information more quickly for more efficient approvals. We're talking about how we take the next steps with that, like. Can we plan check a single family house? There's some challenges, but I think some big opportunities in that area. And hopefully, in the years ahead, the next couple of years, we'll be sort of cracking that nut. And eventually the chatbot will be working to help applicants fill out their planning and building applications and guide them into that online process, which I talked about already, the online application process. And so it's a sort of a guided concierge experience. Everybody gets a guided concierge experience. I know that oftentimes the most simple applicants, the unsophisticated ones today, take the majority of the front counter staff and the planning staff and the building staff's time. And if they had their time freed up from doing that, they could potentially process permits faster. So I'm just going to. This is a question: do my stairs need handrails? And that's from me. I'm not a building guy. I asked an unsophisticated question, but the AI answered the questions and cited the parts of the code where it found the answers, and then it could drill down from there. So a couple of questions in the chat here. Let's see. How do you train AI in Kelowna specific data? What tool was used? Again, we used I'm not the expert here. We use a Microsoft Power generative AI tool, and we pointed it towards just Kelowna data and said, learn these data sets. And I'm not the right guy to answer that. If you want a more technical answer, you could email me, and I can have our IT team provide a response to that. Right now, we're not using an online permitting system for planning applications. There's another question. We're building one behind the scenes using the CityWorks platform, and we've been working on that for quite a while. How does our completeness check work using it? So right now, the chatbot and CityWorks will work together, and so the chatbot will make sure that applicants are prepared with the correct information before they are submitting. But the CityWorks platform, you'll also have to upload the correct things into that to be able to advance in the process. Right now, a big chunk of our applications are still over-the-counter applications, and we do manual checks for completeness, and that has to go for us to be more efficient here. And so again, eventually was I think more simple buildings first. The AI should be able to check and make sure that with pre-approved designs, that a pre-approved design that someone is choosing potentially could fit on the property that they've specified in their application, just by reviewing dimensions. And so again, we've got the front end of our CityWorks process here. So AI will connect right into that, and should be pretty seamless eventually. And there's a lot going on all at the same time with this, with new ideas coming in every day. And so again, happy to take some questions online or offline. And certainly a new tool. The biggest question that we get is, will this eliminate staff positions? And my answer is, I don't believe it will. I believe it may change the nature of work people do every day. If we're anything like most other municipalities in British Columbia, I have staff working at 120% of capacity who would need help with efficiencies. And this is a potential efficiency. If I can get them to 90%, I leave them room to innovate, to go above and beyond, and to focus on the important task of those applications that need more planning, more in-depth problem solving and review to bring those across the line. So that's what we're focusing on. Our focus isn't to reduce staff in the process. It's to be able to do the work we have today with the workforce we already have and help make them more efficient. So I'll leave it there and happy to take questions, and I'm excited to hear from the other presenters.
Hi, Ryan. Thank you very much for that. Jazz Paba, your IT specialist at Kelowna, was unable to participate. Are you able to speak to the issue of security and how to mitigate security issues, like briefly, like what the city is doing?
Yeah, we actually, Jazz's team hires hackers to test the chatbots. So we, on a regular basis with all of our chatbots, are apparently doing that to test to make sure that there is security at a high enough standard to meet like corporate risk factors.
Okay, great. And there's one more question from the city of Vernon. What resources is needed to develop and maintain the system you have developed?
Right now, and I guess so we're it's because they were in heavy development, it's been very resource intensive, both with Microsoft support and our IT team and Intelligent Cities team working pretty heavily on it. And so I probably have to talk offline a little bit further about resources because the resources are in and they're out of the project depending on the needs of the day. Staff resources, like frontline staff resources from our planning teams and building and permitting team, are also being brought in as needed to clarify application journeys, common questions that are asked, even to verify that the chatbots are giving the correct responses to questions they're getting to make sure that quality control is there. That's one of the big sort of questions is like, is the AI actually giving answers that are of any value? Is it giving the correct answers? We don't want our AI giving answers that are incorrect and then having problems on our hands later on where people are saying to us, oh, well, your AI gave the answer. I trusted it. Having said that, we have high staff turnover, or have had in the past at our front counter. And so we have new staff there all the time that may give an incorrect answer on any given day as well.
Great. I'm sure the legal counsel speaking later on will address this, but are you concerned about liability issues related to AI responses?
I mean, yes and no, and I think that's why we do the sort of the back end quality control. But we're not going to be able to learn and innovate unless we take some risks, and we think this is a safe enough space to take some risks in because of the fact that we can do that quality control.
Thank you. Can you explain the role of the Intelligent Cities team?
Yeah, for sure. So we've got a small team of staff that are helping lead, different digital transformation projects throughout the city, and trying to figure out, whether it's partnership opportunities or, how we use different data sources that are coming in through, whether it's our utilities or some of the 5G networks in Kelowna. What are we doing with that? Where does the data go? Are there partnerships that are potentially out there?
That's great. And a very interesting question here. Can the AI unlearn information?
I'm sure we could. I have no idea, to tell you the truth. That'd be a Jazz Pabla question. He's really the expert. I'm the can we do this, Jazz? I'd like to provide better customer service. Here's the areas where I think there's gains, and then Jazz is the how.
Okay, great. I will, after the webinar, I will provide Jazz's contact information. And if you have any questions relating to technology, would it be okay if people contacted him?
Yep, for sure.
Yeah, okay, great. I don't see any more questions. Any more questions for Ryan before he goes? One person. Oh, just accolades. Okay. Well, thank you very much, Ryan. I appreciate your update on the City of Kelowna's AI initiatives. And maybe in a year or two, maybe a year, we should join together again and find out how it all went.
Awesome. Thanks for having me.
Okay. Bye-bye. And now, our next speaker is Dr. Kristen Thomason, Assistant Professor at UBC's Peter A. Allard School of Law. Dr. Thomason will be discussing the potential legal, ethical, and equity issues arising from AI-based decision-making. Welcome, Kristen.
Hi, thanks so much for having me. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can, and I'm bringing up your presentation now.
Perfect. Thank you.
There you go.
Okay, thank you so much. Oh, I want to just keep an eye on the time so I don't run over.
No problem.
Thank you, everybody. It's lovely to be here. as you can see from the slide, I am a law professor. I don't have background in planning. I'm not a deep expert in the technology. I just want to caveat that, similar to the last speaker, that I'm really coming at this from a legal lens. I've been thinking about legal and ethical issues related to automation for the last decade or so. And I write and publish in that space. I think about liability. I think about substantive equality, and I think about how Canada and other countries go about regulating automated technology. So I'll speak about some of that today. But as part of that caveat, I also want to start, I feel like I come into presentations sometimes as a naysayer because I'm raising ethical and legal concerns that you might want to think about. But I do, that doesn't mean that I don't think that there are absolutely amazing opportunities with this technology. I think the last presentation was a really interesting example of that. So what I'm really going to focus on today is at a very high level, and I won't go into too much depth just in the interest of time, but I'm happy to take questions. At a very high level, I'll just go over some of the ethical issues that are really starting to percolate, particularly with larger and larger models that are made available to the broader public. I mean, OpenAI and ChatGPT has been one example that's just been in the news a lot, but there's a range of different models that are becoming more publicly available. And that's been raising a lot of questions. Some of them have been percolating for a long time, but I think others are relatively new concerns. And then, so I'll do that for about the first half of the presentation. And then for the second half, again, at a very high level, I'll just introduce what the Canadian federal government is doing right now in terms of AI regulation. So that's only one jurisdiction, and spoiler alert, it's the law is applicable in commercial uses, but not government uses yet. So I know for a lot of people on this call, you don't have to be too attuned to that law just yet, but just to give you a sense of where Canada is going and what the thinking is right now in Canada in terms of AI regulation and how that intersects with some of these ethical and social issues that are raised by these large systems that we're seeing more and more pervasively in society. Okay. So I've got a few different ethical concerns. There's a whole range of ethical concerns. So like I said, I'm always happy to speak further in questions. But one consideration, and I saw this come up a little bit in some of the discussion in the chat, has to do with intended versus actual use of different systems. So what I'm getting at here is that there are a number of systems that are being developed for, maybe one particular kind of use, but can be deployed for a range of other uses. And having an understanding of what the system is meant for and made for versus how it might be used in a different way is a really important understanding in terms of both what kind of ethical issues it might engage and also potentially what kind of legal liability it might engage, like these new operations or new deployments of a system. And I'm going to give you the example of ChatGPT just because that's something that I think a lot of people have been talking about. So ChatGPT and other large language models are exactly that. They're a large language model. So this is a model that has been developed off of an enormous training data set. So an enormous amount of language in different languages. But, an example is English language text has been used to train a model that is essentially identifying patterns in English language and then using those patterns to predict the kind of words that you want to get when you put in an input. What kind of words might you be expecting as the output? ChatGPT has, I think, received a lot of attention because it's a very sophisticated model and because it's publicly available now. But again, it is a language model. And I think sometimes this isn't always clear in the messaging. Perhaps it's mainly the media messaging or sort of like the more informal messaging. But sometimes I think this gets prompted by the hype that is accompanied by the company as well. Is that, this is a model that really is predicting language responses. And so I've given you an example here on the slide. One of many instances of it being misused. So, a conflict between the intended and actual use has been that we've seen uses of ChatGPT, for instance, as more of a search model than a language model. So it's very good at, giving you written language outputs, but it really shouldn't be used, at least not primarily as a search tool, because that is not what the system does. Google search is a very different type of AI application than ChatGPT and other large language models. And so I saw a couple of questions in the chat about, or maybe there was one question about hallucination. So that's a term that's been used for when a language model like ChatGPT provides you a very persuasive, very confident sounding output response that is, sometimes completely inaccurate and made up. And the reason that you get that kind of response is because this is a language model and not a search model. It's giving you language based on the data that it's been trained on. It's not giving you a search result. And at least in the legal profession, but I think this is probably cross-cutting, we've already seen some high-profile incidents where individuals have used ChatGPT as a search model and then incorporated what they received as a prompt or an output into court documents, and ended up in substantial legal trouble because it made up cases and made up law and didn't have things accurately cited. I see, indexes, internet real time, and Bing search. I think that, the fact that large language models are being integrated with search models is actually more of a reason to be very attuned to what is the tool that I'm using, what is it meant and designed for, and then am I applying it and using it in the same way? This is not to say that you can't use tools for various different purposes, but there are ethical and legal considerations if a tool is taken out of the context for which it was actually designed and applied in a new context without an understanding of the limits. So what I would flag here is that need to really understand what the system is or what it's good at. Maybe not exactly how it works in the inner functionings, but what it's capable of and what it was designed for before applying it into a new scenario. And I think that that's becoming increasingly muddied because a lot of tools are being designed for broad range purposes. Like I've seen people talking about ChatGPT as a doctor, as a lawyer, and quite frankly, it can fulfill maybe certain aspects of those jobs, but it's not going to do those jobs. A chatbot cannot be a lawyer. I'll say that with great confidence. And so having an understanding of the limits, I think, is an important ethical consideration and sometimes an important legal consideration. So when we think of models that are trained on very, very, very large sources of data, another consideration, and again, I'm going high level, happy to dig into this further, is the bias that can come out of the, in the example of language models, the bias that can come out of the language data that's been used to train the system. And this is a consideration that has existed for a long time. It's not new to some of the more popular models that we're seeing, but it certainly is an increasingly important ethical consideration. So as an example, if you train a system off of language taken from the internet, you're going to train into that system many of the biases, you're going to reinforce many of the stereotypes that might exist in that language. Again, when ChatGPT was made available to the public, there were many, well-documented instances that were high profile just because I think people were paying attention to it, of bias being replicated in outputs. And again, this has a lot to do with what the model is actually designed for. It's designed to respond with a prediction of what language are you looking to get, and that's based on the data set on which it's trained. That engages this idea of needing very large data sources in order to create a model, engages additional ethical and legal considerations. One that comes up a lot with some of the large language models that we're seeing is privacy. So how is the data collected that is used to train the model? The Privacy Commissioner in Canada has initiated an investigation into OpenAI's well, there's not a lot of details on it, but into OpenAI with the possibility of, or a consideration of, whether any of our privacy laws have been engaged in the development of the data set for training that model. Additionally, you may have seen in the news, again, this has been high profile, copyright concerns raised by artists, by writers, for the use of their works without their permission. So this lack of consent for how data is being used is another consideration, at least an ethical consideration, if it doesn't turn out to also be a legal consideration in terms of the creation of large models. But this can apply also for small models. So it doesn't have to be that you have a large data source. It really has to do with how is the data collected. Additional to that, another consideration that has been raised, again, in relation especially to large language models that use information scraped off the internet, are concerns about Indigenous data sovereignty. So where information is shared on the internet with one intended audience, but then is collected and used in ways that violate that intention, whether that violates principles of Indigenous data sovereignty as well. Additionally, with a very, very large data set, it becomes increasingly hard to go through and curate the data. And I'm going to come back to that in a few minutes, because there have also been concerns raised about the labor implications of how data curation happens. But it just, there's, with a large data set where you can't actually oversee what data exactly is going into the training, you lose the ability to mitigate things like discriminatory bias in outputs or in decision making that might be generated through the system. Whereas with very small models, there might be a little bit more opportunity for human oversight and control over what kind of data is being used, and then also ensuring that the models that are built off of that data don't replicate or reinforce bias or discrimination. And I think this is maybe a newer concern, or at least it's gaining new attention, largely because of the enormous computing power needed for larger and larger automated systems. But the environmental impact and planetary impact of AI systems is a growing ethical, if not legal, although we don't really see a legal connection here just yet, but it's certainly an ethical consideration. And I thought I would flag that for this audience in particular, because you think about planning, you think about environments. So there's a lot of research out there. It's sort of a growing field, I would say, but there is a growing body of scientific work trying to figure out the planetary impact of different AI systems. So that can have to do with the electricity needed to run the computers that can process all of this information. That can have to do with the actual resource implications of building different types of computer systems, the rare earth minerals or the difficult to obtain earth minerals that are components of computer systems. There is a borderless connection or web of connections that exists sort of behind the scenes to what we see on a website when we type in, a prompt and receive an output. That the implications behind that, including the planetary implications, are quite substantial. If you're interested in reading more about this, one book that I found to be very accessible and interesting and engaging is called Atlas of AI by Kate Crawford. I'm sorry I didn't put that one on this slide because it might have been helpful to have, but I found that book to be a very useful sort of introduction to some of the thinking more about the planetary impacts of large systems. And I mentioned I would come back to labor. So there have also been a range of labor considerations, and a question I think came up in the last discussion too about like the possibility of replacing people with AI systems. I agree with the comments that Ryan made that oftentimes, systems can be used in ways that actually aid with work and resources as opposed to necessarily replacing workers. But we have certainly seen incidents where chatbots and other types of AI systems have replaced labor. I have one. Again, it was sort of a high profile example at the time instance. It's just a news story here where, as workers seek to unionize, that's when a management decision is made to replace those workers with chatbots. In this particular eating disorder case, the chatbot that was then deployed actually, threatened very real harm on the vulnerable patients that were seeking care through this clinic. And so raised, I think, a range of concerns about harm, like harm both to the workers who lost their gainful employment, harm potentially to other workers who might be considering collective action, and then harm to vulnerable patients who were seeking much needed care, because the outputs from the AI system actually would conflict with the type of advice that you would want to give to somebody who is experiencing an eating disorder. But other labor considerations loop us back to some of that thinking about large models, large data sets that are sort of, too big for one person or a group of people to oversee. And so this was, it was a fairly significant news story when it came out. I think it was last summer, or maybe last year. But there's just one example. Again, I don't mean to pick on any particular company, but because OpenAI has been so covered in the media, I think that's why there's been a lot of investigative reporting as well. But the way in which companies deal with some of those concerns, like the possibility of hate-filled outputs, because the training data has been taken from the internet and there's not really control over what exactly it includes. The way in which companies ensure that these unwanted outputs don't happen we've seen incidents has involved concerning labor practices, like hiring folks in the global south to engage in what can be very psychologically damaging work at a very low rate of pay. So these are some other considerations. Again, I'm framing some somewhat very significant, but somewhat abstract to the day-to-day uses of AI tools, but some significant ethical considerations that I still grapple with, and how do we bring this into our legal and practical thinking. But I think it's important to have those just in back of mind, particularly if you have an opportunity to make a choice about what kind of tool you might want to adopt and in what kind of context. Okay, so those, again, just high level, just introducing some considerations, particularly those that arise from large systems. But now shifting gears to thinking about the law. And so again, they're all different jurisdictions in Canada. Different jurisdictions will be thinking about things differently. But as a lawyer and a legal academic who's thinking a lot about the regulation of automation, one of the biggest developments right now in Canada is the AI and Data Act, which is proposed in Bill C-27, which is under review at the Industry and Technology Committee right now. I, in fact, had the opportunity to give testimony to the committee just yesterday, so this is all very fresh and top of mind. But I just thought I would introduce you to what's happening in that regulatory space, in part because it might be helpful to your work and how you're thinking, especially if you are actually working in a commercial space as opposed to a government space. This law might be applicable to you. And additionally, this probably, I would anticipate, will set at least some of the tone for how other jurisdictions in Canada might start thinking about regulating. So it's worthwhile to just be cognizant of. Okay, so the next set of slides is giving you, I just thought it would be helpful for you to actually see the provisions that I'm talking about as I talk about them. There's a lot of words. Don't worry, I'm happy for Sophie to share these slides with you if you'd like to see them, or you can Google the Act and you can pull it up there. But just to have them in the background as I speak. So the Act is applicable to artificial intelligence. That's unsurprising since it's called the AI and Data Act. There's a definition in the Act right now, but it's actually potentially or likely subject to some amendment to bring it into greater line with definitions in other jurisdictions. I think for our purposes right now, it's not too significant other than to say this is really looking at these kind of automated computer-based systems. Okay, the structure of the Act is one framed around risk or harm mitigation. So you can see here, the basic idea and the requirements are set out in sections 9 to 12 that people who are responsible for artificial intelligence systems are responsible to basically try to anticipate the risks of harm. I'll talk about what that looks like, and the risks of biased output. I'll talk about that too. And then take steps to try to mitigate that, and then also keep records on how it is that they went about that process. So risk mitigation is one of many different kinds of approaches that we could take in the law. I mean, another approach would be a human rights approach that might set out certain values that can't be violated. And if they are, there's some kind of recourse. That's not this approach. This approach is think ahead and then try to anticipate and mitigate. That is very reflective of what we already see in Canada in tort law, which for anyone who's not familiar is an area of law that basically sets out your private responsibility to others. One of the limits that is inevitable with a risk mitigation approach to regulating is that it's going to be limited to what's foreseeable. And we've already seen a number of instances of very real harm arising from the use of an AI system, and the developers or the operators say that was completely unforeseeable to us. But there are other people who say, well, it would have been foreseeable to me because I'm exactly the person who gets harmed by this kind of system or by this kind of operation. And so there are a lot of questions, I think, still circulating, certainly for me, still circulating about how do we make sure that the people responsible for anticipating harm actually have the capacity to anticipate and mitigate as much harm as possible if this is the approach we're going to take to regulation. Harm in the Act is defined as physical or psychological harm to the person, damage to their personal property, or economic loss to the individual. So, this seems to be framed in the Act as forward-looking, so harm coming out of an AI system. And it would strike me, although, of course, we're waiting to get more clarity on exactly how this act will apply, some of which will come in regulations. But it would strike me that this would not include things like harm to those involved in the labor necessary to label and weed out, psychologically injurious content. Maybe it would, but it would strike me that the act is designed very much to be forward-looking and dealing with outputs from AI systems. Additionally, when we think about equity in particular, a concern with this definition is that it's very much focused on individual harm. Not to say that that's not important, that's definitely significant, but there's another way in which AI systems can cause harm, and that's harm at the collective or group level. So I gave you one example of like environmental impacts. Environmental impacts don't necessarily, they may, but they don't necessarily impact us each as individuals, but they do cause a harm or a loss that affects us all as a group. Adverse discrimination is another example of something that can affect the group. Stereotyping against a group based on, let's say based on gender, affects all people of that gender, but maybe not causing them personal, physical, or psychological harm, but it does have a negative impact. But that negative impact is predominant at the group level. And this would be something that's not totally unfathomable to the law. There are some instances in the law where group rights are protected, but the sort of colonial legal system that exists in Canada is typically more focused on individual injury, and so this is reflective of that. But AI, because of the way that it is trained to detect patterns and to draw out inferences based on sort of group and social network connections, as one example, is going to have more and more impact at that group level. And so the fact that the act doesn't capture that, I think, is going to limit how much harm it actually mitigates. This is a lot of words, but I gave you the whole provision. I tried to highlight the part that's most significant. So the other thing that the act is trying to mitigate is biased outputs. I think that's important. Really what they're talking about is adverse discrimination. So, I think this is a really significant provision. There are some limits, though, to how this provision will operate, especially if we come at this through, again, like a substantive equality or equity lens. I don't have too much time to get into it, but I'll just say, one aspect is that this provision would seem to capture discrimination based on a ground listed in the Canadian Human Rights Act. So gender, race, ethnicity, et cetera. There's a whole list of grounds that exist in the Canadian Human Rights Act. That to me reads as though you would have to experience discrimination on the basis of gender. But the way that a lot of AI systems work, and we've already seen high profile incidents of this, is that the system detects a pattern that might be reflective of, for example, gender or race or an intersection of both, but is not directly discriminating based on gender. So an example is like a resume reading tool that detects patterns of words in resumes that they're not like man or woman or identifying race, but they're reflective of, they're what we call proxies of those identifiable grounds. And so the adverse discrimination does occur. It is based on a proxy that stands in for the protected ground. And it's not clear that that would necessarily be captured in the Act as we see it right now. And then an additional consideration is that there has been critique from the sort of anti-discrimination, equality, world of academics and advocates that the Canadian Human Rights Act grounds need to be expanded. And so, of course, if we rely on that in the Act, something like, for instance, poverty or class would not be reflected. But we certainly have seen instances of discrimination on that basis arising from AI systems. So that wouldn't be captured here. Okay, cognizant of the time. I think I have 3 minutes left. So I'll just briefly say the Act is also limited to high impact systems. As of right now in the Act, we don't actually know what a high impact system is. But as we were sitting here, I just saw an update that the Minister of Industry has proposed an amendment to actually give more scope to what we mean by high impact system. So I'm going to have to read that before I can tell you anything about it. But I think there has been a recognition by the drafters of the AI and Data Act that this needs more definition so that we know what systems this actually applies to. I do think that even, a system that you might think might not cause a lot of harm, there are instances already of, these sort of smaller systems causing the kinds of harms that we're talking about. And so that's where having that awareness of the ethical and potential legal issues involved in the decision to adopt an AI system can be really helpful to mitigate some of that, even if it is a smaller system or maybe doesn't fall within the scope of the Act. And then I think this is probably relevant to a lot of you on the call. Government institutions have been excluded from the scope of the AI and Data Act. So what does that mean? I mean, this is also a federal government piece of legislation. Many of you might be working with it, municipalities or the province. So maybe this wouldn't be directly applicable anyhow. But what does this mean? My sense would be that this may mean that we would see a separate piece of legislation that will regulate government uses. That's what we've seen in privacy law, where, there's sort of a commercial act that regulates commercial uses or collection of information and commercial privacy interests, and then separate pieces of legislation that regulate privacy within government operations. So we might anticipate something like that arising, but it also leaves a lot of scope for the provinces and municipalities to think about their own sort of set of guidance and tools that they want to use for the operation of artificial intelligence systems. I think it's really important that we're getting guidance. I think there are limits to the guidance that we're seeing right now. And I also think there's obviously a huge range of other aspects to the use of AI that's going to need more clarity in terms of where liability is going to lie. And something we're not seeing yet is how do you get compensation if you are injured? That's not addressed with the AI Data Act. It's much more about regulating the companies, the operators of AI systems, to try to encourage, through the possibility of some pretty hefty fines, try to encourage taking really seriously this approach to risk mitigation. So as much as I see some limits, it is helpful to see that we're starting to see some development in legal clarity here. And what's next? I mean, this bill is under review. I mean, there's always the possibility if the government falls that the bill's dead, and then we'll have to see what happens. But the bill is under review right now, assuming it passes. There's a lot left to development in the regulations. And so there might also be opportunities for public consultation, perhaps from some of the folks on this call. You might be interested in submitting to a public consultation. And then, of course, we're just going to have to see more research and advocacy around the actual harms that arise from the use of AI in Canada, and whether those are sufficiently captured by this bill, or whether we're going to need some further rubric and structure to mitigating and compensating as much harm as possible. Okay, like I said, happy to take questions, and I'll leave it there. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kristen. That was great. While people are typing their questions, I just wanted to say this was such an interesting presentation. You brought up many considerations, both legal and ethical. It's evident that a lot more work needs to be done in this area. However, it's great that we are talking about the risks, and it's very important for both organizations, both public and private, and individuals to be educated and aware of all the issues and considerations. So thank you again. Some people are typing. Let's wait a few seconds and see if any questions come up. You've done a great job of answering them as you went along. Oh, okay. Let me just. So G. Keller says, I think there are good reasons to be concerned with some aspects of AI. One example is the fact that you can prompt ChatGPT with prompts such as Dan prompt, which is a form of jailbreak, which seems to free the chatbot from the moral and ethical limitations that were designed into the system. Do you think the law will address the design of AI systems to ensure that the AI designers do not continue to allow users to jailbreak the systems? I've never heard of this term before.
I think, I mean, I think it's a great question just to think even about the law regulating design. Even stepping back, I mean, I think this is a good instance of a concern where design needs to be contemplated by the law in some way. And I would say the AI and Data Act isn't really getting into design. It's much more about, I mean, there are aspects to like thinking about mitigation if you're one of the developers of AI. But it would strike me that the AI and Data Act is much more about the use of AI. Something that we've learned, something that I always like to say is like, this is not the first new technology that we as humans have experienced. There are transformative technologies. There are many transformative technologies that we can think about having arisen throughout history. And there are a lot of lessons that can be learned from how we have dealt with them socially and ethically and, even more recently, legally. So one example is like the car, which was also a transformative technology in the sense that it had a major impact on how we've structured societies in any number of countries. One legal lesson learned from regulating vehicles is that for a long time, regulators resisted regulating the design of cars. And that, that caused a lot of unnecessary death and injury until around the 1960s or 70s, when it became a topic of enormous public concern and pushback. And then regulators started regulating the design of cars. And since then, I would say, I mean, feel free to correct me if you disagree, but I would say it's become non-controversial that regulators regulate the design of cars. And that's not that they're saying like, you must design a car this way, but regulators have created, safety requirements. Like you can't have certain types of design and you have to test designs to meet certain safety standards. And that does limit what car designers can build to some degree, but it's, the trade-off of that isn't that we've lost innovation, it's that innovations are designed more safely. And so I think your question is getting at that, which is that we're not really seeing regulators eager to regulate design. And from what I've seen in the discourse, it's often because they're afraid of impeding innovation. But I think what is the innovation that we as a society want? We, of course, want safe technologies. And so I think it's a good point to be thinking about how does the law deal with design decisions, and can it start to have some input into rubrics or structures around the kinds of designs that are permissible. And that could include things like security, hacking, jailbreaking, et cetera. Oh,
Interesting. It's much like the BC Building Code.
I don't know too much about the BC Building Code, but maybe.
Yeah. Lots of questions here. What are some of the more common challenges you're seeing coming up with the use of AI? Is there any percent in other countries, dealing with AI regulations? And then she recalls seeing EU taking a harder stance.
Yeah. I mean, some of the common challenges in terms of like the law are, I would say, a lack of clarity has been what I see come up a lot on the part of like lawyers, on the part of industry, on the part of, folks, advocates and folks who are concerned about the harms, is just that there's this sense that we don't quite yet know how the law is going to apply to some of these systems, not because we don't have laws that will apply, but we just don't know what the outcome is going to look like. Like there's all these copyright class actions against different generative AI tools right now. And there's a sense that we're not, we know copyright is relevant here, but we don't exactly know how the copyright requirements and the different provisions that allow for use of others' works are going to apply to these models in particular. And so sort of waiting for some clarity on that. I think that, you have the point about the EU, the GDPR, and the EU also has an AI Act that is much more prescriptive than what Canada's proposed legislation is much more involved. It's a lot more detailed. And I think it's guided exactly, in at least in part, by that concern that there is a sense of a lack of clarity. The US is also developing AI, some ideas around AI regulation in California as well. So there certainly are some international developments, other countries too. So China and Singapore are also developing AI legislation. So there's certainly a lot to look at for input and advice. I wouldn't say Canada has been seen as like this innovative legal leader necessarily, but I think that there's still some opportunity given that it's under review right now. But I'd say that's one of the sort of common themes, at least in the legal space, is this sense of like, we're not really sure what this is going to look like yet.
Does the bill contemplate deliberate or reckless information? And Chris gives an example there regarding climate change.
Yeah. So, I mean, not exactly. So it's going back, it's all about this sort of anticipating harm and the harm. So this, I think, goes to my point about collective harm in a way. Like, misinformation is going to affect us potentially on an individual level. Like, you could, receive misinformation and then do something that causes an injury. And if you can draw out the causal link, maybe you could say that that's a direct individual harm. But I think misinformation's harm is in many ways on a collective level. Like, what are people believing and what does that mean about social norms or policy trajectories or elections and how we vote and, who our leadership is? Like, those are all really significant issues, but they're not individual harm. So I think that the act does maybe capture deliberate misinformation if the user of an AI system is using it for that. I think it would capture that, because you could say that there's like the risk of, psychological harm, at least, maybe, depending on what the information is. Although climate denial, I don't think would necessarily cause individual psychological harm. It's a really tricky question to answer. And I think it goes back to some of the limits on this piece of legislation, which I think is much more about like trying to eliminate certain types of high profile injuries, as opposed to dealing with some of the higher level collective problems that we're going to see more and more with AI. I'll just say, I gave testimony yesterday. I was collaborating with LEAF, which is the Women's Legal Education and Action Fund. And one of the recommendations that we gave is that the act should integrate collective harm so that it can deal with concerns like this more head on.
Great. And very, very quickly, who would enforce these AI laws? We have about a minute left.
Sure. So the AI and Data Act is a federal law. It's going to be under, it seems, the control of the Ministry of Industry. And so that would be sort of the overarching ministry that would be responsible for the act. But it also seems to draw on the federal government's criminal law head of power, because some of the penalties are, or many of the penalties are, criminal in nature. And so I think that's also a really excellent question. Like, I would imagine that might engage policing, federal policing perhaps in some ways, but it's under the oversight of the Ministry of Industry.
Great. Thank you, Kristen. Very, very interesting. I appreciate your time. I know you're a busy prof. Our final
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
No problem. Our final speaker today is Lindsay Bedard, Senior Consultant, Community Design Solutions at Esri Canada. Lindsay will present on the importance of collecting accurate and timely data to support AI functions. Lindsay, thank you so much for your patience.
Thanks for having me.
There you go. I'll give you the floor.
Great, thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Lindsay Bedard. I work for Esri Canada. We are a distributor of Esri Geographic Information Systems, GIS products and software. I support users across Canada use ArcGIS products and web-based applications for long-range and short-term urban, municipal, and regional planning purposes. Like my fellow presenters, I'm not necessarily an expert in AI, but my colleagues use it and my customers use it. So most of my experience with it, I'll be speaking kind of anecdotally from their experiences. I will be providing a resource slide at the end of this presentation. So if you would like to learn more about this topic, you'll have a lot of resources to look into. And also, if you would like a more technical presentation, I do recommend that you reach out to your account manager or sales representative at Esri Canada, and they can coordinate a conversation with you and the appropriate subject matter expert to help you for your needs. So Esri Inc. has developed some deep learning models, ArcGIS deep learning models. And machine learning tools, they're not really a new concept in GIS spatial analysis. For years, you've been able to perform image classification on remotely sensed imagery, even things like enriching data with clustering tools to show spatial relationships. A lot of the underlying principles there are based in machine learning. Machine learning is a branch of artificial intelligence in which structured data is processed with an algorithm to solve a problem. Traditional structured data requires a person to label the data. So you would go in manually into a picture, for example, and indicate that this point is a tree or a car. And this would allow specific features associated with these things to be understood within the algorithm and used to identify these objects in other pictures. Deep learning is a subset of machine learning that uses several layers of algorithms in the form of neural networks. So it's essentially a bit more advanced than machine learning in terms of technically what's happening in the background. The input data is analyzed through different layers of the network, with each layer defining specific features and patterns for the data. So, for example, if you wanted to identify features such as buildings and roads, the deep learning model can be trained with images of different buildings and different roads, processing the information through layers within this neural network, and then finding the identifiers required to classify these items as the appropriate elements. Esri has developed tools and workflows to utilize innovations in deep learning to better analyze and extract data from things like remotely sensed imagery and LiDAR point cloud data. Computer vision, or the ability of computers to gain understanding from digital images or videos, is an area that has been shifting from traditional machine learning algorithms to deep learning methods. So there's a bit of a misconception that with AI and deep learning, it allows you to click a button and everything is done for you. There is manual work involved. That's part of the reason Esri developed some pre-trained models of common uses. This takes out a lot of the upfront effort for you. But you also do have the ability to train your own models and use those in ArcGIS Pro. And that's very simplistically shown here through this workflow diagram. The ArcGIS pre-trained deep learning models that Esri offers eliminate the need for training data. And so these training data sets are often quite large data sets and require a lot of computing power. With these deep learning models, you're able to at least partially automate the extraction of that information from your imagery and point cloud data sets. And the team at Esri Inc. that works on these deep learning models, they're working on them on an ongoing basis to enhance the existing models and to also provide new pre-trained models to users that would complement these existing models. And if you have an ArcGIS Pro license, you have access to the models through the ArcGIS Living Atlas. However, I do want to point out that in some instances, additional Pro extensions might be required. So again, if you run into that kind of issue, it's best to contact your sales representative or account manager to help you out there. So before applying deep learning to imagery, it's important to understand that there are different applications of deep learning. There's many different tasks that can be accomplished with different deep learning models. And Esri has developed many different tools to allow you to perform different tasks like those listed here to accomplish a specific goal. And so I'll go through kind of examples of how you may use some of these different classification tools or rather deep learning tools. So for image classification, common uses we see here would be you have an image and you're classifying forest uses versus urban land uses versus agricultural land uses. That's often what we see kind of on a large scale, regional scale. For object detection, this is interesting. So this allows you to locate specific features. So this can be something like if you have a plan view remotely sensed image and you're able to detect cars in them. This can be useful for identifying parking. So we have a lot of users looking to do analysis of their existing surface parking to kind of review their parking requirements. And so these deep learning tools can assist in this type of analysis. And so there are models for that as well. Something like semantic segmentation. This is also an interesting one. So you have an image and it's able to essentially detect what pixels belong to a certain class. So for instance, it can detect if it's roads and it would extract that information and create a road class for you. So this can also be useful if you don't necessarily have that vector-based data. You might have the road center line. You might have parcels. So you'll have a good idea of the road right of way, but you may not have the actual road. And so this could actually give you a bit of extra information there if needed. Instance segmentation in this instance, no pun intended, a boundary is actually drawn around the object. And so you get a bit more detail than, say, the object detection method. It's actually drawing a boundary around, say, your cars or your buildings in the image. Panoptic segmentation combines the previous two tasks. And so not only are you drawing that boundary, you're also classifying those pixels. Image translation is an interesting one. This allows you to take, say, an image with a lot of noise or a low resolution image and apply things like noise reduction and super resolution to it. So this tool essentially is guessing what the image would look like if you had a higher resolution image, and then that allows you to maybe use it in other ways as well. And then change detection. This is one we commonly see for things like monitoring construction progress over time. So you would have an image from one time frame, and then maybe a year or two later, the same location, and you would determine the construction that occurred there. And so for this, there's a lot of really important questions to ask yourself before you start digging into these deep learning models I mentioned. And so I wanted to go through those questions with you all today, just kind of food for thought. So the first thing is to ask yourself, what is the purpose of your work? What are your ultimate goals and objectives? It's really important that you have clearly defined scope of work, so you're not just you're not going off track, you're not going too far in the wrong direction, and this will also inform your data needs and approach. Um, then you should also ask yourself what data is actually needed or actually required to meet your objectives. It's a good idea if you're interested in these deep learning models to review them and see what's required for them. And then also review available data, which will feed into the next question I have. But I think there's probably going to be a bit of an iterative process here, maybe starting a little bit and then going back to these data needs as well. A really important question to ask yourself is whether there are openly available sources of data, internal sources of data, or other information available to you that could be converted into a GIS format. What a lot of people don't realize is there's a lot of data available to them openly, but it comes from multiple governing sources. And so they're maybe not aware that it exists. And so some data could be at the provincial level, some could be at the municipal level, some could be federal. Some could exist in places you wouldn't necessarily expect, like Statistics Canada data in tabular format that you could convert to spatial data, or Natural Resources Canada data. So looking into your options there is really important. And there also could be, if you work for a municipality or for a larger consulting firm, there may be other departments that have information that could be useful for you. So that's often something we hear about a lot, that we people ask us if we have data, and really it's just another internal department that could assist them with it within their organization. And the other thing too, it's if you have licenses or subscriptions, you may also have data sets available to you. I can only speak to what you have available through through Esri, but if you already have ArcGIS Pro, then you also have ArcGIS Online, and you have a lot of data sets available to you in ready to use formats. So so taking advantage of things like that it can be really beneficial. The next question to ask yourself is what level of accuracy and precision are required for your purposes? You can have too much or too little detail in your data. Um, in more sounds like more, but if you have too much detail, you essentially have more data, and this can become extremely cumbersome and costly in terms of storage. As we've heard, storing excessive amounts of data on servers not only costs you money, but it does have environmental impacts as well. And so if you're not going to use the data, spending the money to store it doesn't necessarily make sense. And then finally, if you've exhausted your resources, and based on your needs and what's available to you, then ask yourself if you need to collect data or have data collected. And so basically, do you need to hire someone to collect data for you? And if you do this, with any contract, you should really make sure that you understand what you're getting into. And if you aren't an expert in the area, work with experts. We have a lot of customers maybe expecting one thing from their data collection agreements, and they maybe don't get what they were expecting. They may have more data cleanup than anticipated, for example. And also just making sure things like if you do need to make something public, making sure that's an option for you in the agreement you signed. Um, and then finally, we're down to the last few minutes. So I'll just go to the resources slide here. And as I said, if you do want to learn more, I do recommend reaching out to your sales rep or account manager to arrange a conversation. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here with me today. And I'll now do my best to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you, Lindsay. I appreciate that. One question. For GIS analysis, are you stating AI is used in the analysis, creation of mapping information? If so, is it considered a resource or a limitation or other?
In certain instances, yes, AI can be used to, it's not necessarily creating mapping information, but it's maybe extracting information from other data. And in this instance, I would definitely say it's a resource. Kind of to again to reflect some of the sentiments that the previous presenters had stated as well. We also don't really see it as something necessarily taking work away from anyone. It really just enhances our workflows. We're able to extract more data. We still need to do quality checks on it. And so again, it's not, we don't just extract the information and trust that it's good. We are still going through it to a certain level of quality assurance.
Who would determine what AI would extract from the original data?
So yeah, so that kind of depends actually. So if you do if you create your own deep learning model, then you can actually make that decision. And then the pre-trained models have certain parameters, I guess, of what they extract. And so one might be roads, one might be buildings, but there's also the option to combine this information as well. So if you need to layer that information, then you have that opportunity as well.
Okay, great. Any more questions for Lindsay? How specifically would you integrate your GIS products with products like OpenAI's chatbot and other GIS systems that are being used for completeness, check, and plan checking?
Unfortunately, I'm not personally familiar with OpenAI's chatbot, so I'm unable to give you an answer specifically relating to that today. So I can look into it and follow up through Sophie if that's okay.
Sure. T. Smith, please contact Lindsay when I send you her contact information, and you can follow up with her. And Lindsay, you can talk offline. Great. Any more questions? I think looking at the time, it's 1:30. We'll take the last question from Spencer. Just accolades, Lindsay. Well,
Well,
thank you
that's great. Thank you all.
thank you very much. Thank you to all our speakers again, Ryan Smith, Dr. Kristen Thomason, and Lindsay Bedart for their fabulous presentation today. And I'm sure everyone's learned a lot on this fairly new technology. So thank you all for participating today. And I'm just going to go to my final slide here. And it's not coming up. Hold on. There we go. Just to let you know, if you're a PIBC member, please be reminded to log in online and record your 1.5 CPL units that you earned today. As well, upcoming PIBC events and webinars include December 6th, we will be holding a free ethics in planning webinar. And I'm sure that this might be an important topic within that realm. January 31st, 2024 is our very popular annual planning outlook. CMHC is participating, and economists from Rene and Blair Chisholm from Pooney Group to talk about commercial industrial. So that's a very popular webinar. And finally, February 28th, we will be talking about planning for food security, and we will have representatives from the ministry attending to give us an update on some of their food policies and agricultural policies. Thank you all for watching, and I will say bye for now.